Me. My name is Joshua Stenhouse. I'm the field CTO for cyber resilience at Rubrik. And one of the many things that I do at Rubrik, other than talking to customers, prospects, and the likes of Gartner, etc., and yourselves, is also sitting on our ransomware response team, where we get to see, hey, if somebody's attacked, 118, call Rubrik. We're then immediately brought in. We have a dedicated team who have been through many attacks, so that they know what to do, they know what the customers need, and they get in. And if you're actually going to take away one takeaway from this whole thing, the fact that you could call a data protection vendor and they have a dedicated ransomware response team that are most busy Friday night to Saturday morning, which is when most attacks happen, that is one huge benefit in itself. And that's one of the reasons why we do what we do, is that we're there in the most desperate time of need for any IT department, which is going to be an attack. But what I really want to start with is just high level anatomy of an attack. And I don't need 10, 15 slides on the state of ransomware. We're all very much aware of the current state, but it is important to break down that from a data protection standpoint, what can you do and where can you help and where can you not? And so, as you already heard very clearly, that because we're approaching this from the ground up in terms of data protection, that yes, every organization in the world has multiple layers of defense, teams and people and solutions to try and stop the attack happening in the first place. But there are humans in the mix. Anyone's capable of clicking anything. Even if you work in this industry, we've all done it. You have zero-day vulnerabilities, and there's always the chance that the worst could happen. An attacker could be in and on a network and then traversing it. And what we've now seen over the last year and a half is their behavior on that network is changing, in that pretty much now in every attack, every ransom note says, I have your data and I'm going to release it. And the interesting thing is that you could bring in a team and do forensics for multiple weeks. And because they've established persistence via a backdoor, they can't tell you what was actually stolen, but you have to infer from, well, the minimum that they likely had access to of where they were on the network, this is now the minimum that we have to consider exfiltrated. Once they've finished the exfiltration, the next thing they'll do is make sure that the customer has no ability to recover from backup, because it's a known place to do recovery. They're very good at enumerating, sharing documentation on how to defeat each type of backup solution there might be out there. And it's a very simple reason why, is that I delete, or most commonly actually just have your backups expire themselves, and I know you have no ability to recover from backup. And then they encrypt the data and leave the ransom note. And so there are 5 distinct areas that Rubrik is helping our customers with today. And assuming breach, number 1, most important of all to begin with, because nothing else matters if you don't have number 1, is that if the attacker gets in and gets a domain admin account, how do we ensure there is absolutely no way, no loophole that they can use to delete or expire the backups? That's really important. I'm going to give you the detail of how we do that and all the different protections involved in making that a possibility. But just having the backups means that, yeah, great, you've been attacked. We immediately don't have to start looking at how we're going to pay this ransom. But your downtime will still be measured in weeks if you don't have answers to the remaining questions. And that, presuming you can get past number 1, is now the biggest problem statement. So number 2, endpoint protection failed to stop them encrypting the data. So what is the blast radius of the attack? They're saying that they've stolen the data. We're being asked by our board and investors, well, what did they even steal? So how do you know what sensitive data was at risk? 4, how do we identify a clean recovery point? Because for anything with an operating system, just because we're encrypted on Friday night doesn't mean we can just recover to Thursday night's backup. We're more than likely going to be reintroducing the attacker, and then they just have immediate access to encrypt the data again. And then 5, how do we automate this and test and prove that we could actually do it in the event of an attack? So this is something that I present on a daily basis to organizations all over the world, irrespective of size, all the way from the biggest to the smallest. And it's very common to say, hey, this is where we sit, this is what we help with. And the first question I ask them is this along the lines of what you're looking to design to defend against? I've yet to hear anyone say no, but I'm interested, before we move on, from your feedback as delegates, is this along the lines of what you're seeing as a common set of requirements when we're focusing on this from data protection? So we start with number one. I have to level set on a few key terms because as we all know, everybody's saying multiple words and not necessarily meaning the same things. And it depends on which standpoint you're coming from as to what you mean. So I'll start in the middle. And I bet you've all heard every data protection vendor in the world say immutability 1,000 times in the last 6-12 months. And immutability is certainly very important. All it means is that something can or cannot be edited. And we've got to make sure that the backup data can't be edited. Otherwise, it can be encrypted. And therefore, I have no ability to recover. But immutable backups can still most definitely be expired. And the most common attack method against backup is, well, I'm just going to log in as an admin and shorten your retention and have it delete them itself. So I don't even have to encrypt the data. And so you have to combine that with a retention lock. And you have to consider, how is that retention lock implemented and how secure is it? Because it's not good enough to just say, well, we have a retention lock. How are you implementing it? Because that is what the attacker is going to look to leverage of remove the lock and I can delete your data. And we have to also consider the default posture of the backup data itself on the network. And most specifically these days, making sure that it itself is not a source of exfiltration. When you look at the likes of the Conti ransomware gang and what they're doing with backup technologies is that they're actually just using it to steal data before they then go and encrypt it. And that isn't even anything new because we've seen in previous attacks, like for example, Sony, where they just stole the data from the backup platform and then deleted it. So if we talk about protecting backup data and its posture, when I say no air gap, I simply mean that the backups are on a browsable, mountable file system. They're accessible from a compromised host in the network. If I say physical air gap, for me, the only true physical air gap is a tape. Tape once removed from a system cannot be compromised, but just so happens to be so slow to recover, it might actually be cost beneficial impact-wise to just pay the ransom. You can also periodically turn off connections. That's often interpreted as good enough to say it's a physical air gap. And the interesting thing that Rubrik has is something in between, which we're going to dive into more detail on. And I call it a logical air gap because, yes, it's physically connected, giving you the fastest recovery speed. But if I can store it in a way that cannot be accessed, mounted, and therefore compromised, then it gives you that perfect sweet spot. And interestingly, at Rubrik, we have options for both. I'm going to cover both in detail and as to who does what and why, but it's very important we level set on these terms before we move on. So you saw this slide already from Soham, but I want to just dial in on one really important thing here is that when you look at traditional approaches to backup, and it's usually backup software writing to some sort of deduplicated storage appliance or server or hardware, yada, yada, or maybe it's already switched to an appliance base, maybe it's switched to scale out, but it's all still storage first, and then backup software is a user of that storage. And immutability, air gap, quite even just simple basics of MFA is most definitely an afterthought and not out there today. So the net result that you see is that time after time with this approach, because security is an afterthought, because the majority of backup teams out there think that security isn't their job for the most part, and security teams think, well, backup is the backup team's job. That is the loophole that the attacker is looking to leverage because they're all got contrasting opinions.
There are also a couple of storage vendors out there that provide snapshotting technology for end replication, for backup and disaster recovery, providing similar claims. How do you?
Agreed. And so the key thing there is that, yes, you can do a snapshot. Yes, the snapshot is immutable, but it's still on device or another device of the same vendor. And we've seen multiple attacks where they've compromised that storage device's interface or admin console and then just deleted or expired the backups anyway. But it's not to say that that isn't a viable approach. And multiple layers of defense, I would still advocate trying to protect at that layer if you can. But all we're saying is that you still need a separate backup. You're going to do that for compliance reasons anyway. So layer this on because you're going to need it in all likelihood. And it certainly doesn't degrade your posture by adding more layers. So if you have this architecture, the key thing that we've seen is a major attack is an unrecoverable event. They'll just delete. the backups or shorten the retention from the backup software. It's probably not MFA across the board, if at all, or they'll just go straight to the underlying storage, steal the data and delete it. The best example is the Sony attack. And the two key things you'll see vendors with these architectures do is in the SMB space, they'll say, hey, we know this is compromisable. So our solution is we're going to tier the data up to cloud, and we'll layer on retention, immutability, and that gives you a logical air gap in that it's separate from your environment. And that will protect the data, but your downtime is still going to be measured in weeks while you download it. And that's presuming that you even know the correct point in time to recover. And then more in the enterprise space, you'll see vendors with this architecture say, we know this is completely compromisable. So our solution is, surprise, surprise, we're going to sell you more. We're going to sell you a third copy. We'll call it a cyber vault. We'll periodically turn off a connection to create this supposed air gap. And it will protect the backups because now it's read-only. They can layer on immutability, retention lock, etc. But it's particularly galling for customers that you're only selling me this because the first copy can't be protected. And so this is a core change of Rubrik in that, as you heard from Soham, that yes, we came to market 7 years ago. The first modern hyper-converged backup software, backup storage, HTML5, API first, scale out, instantly tier your data to cloud, instantly mount it. These are all now table stakes. You could watch 5 presentations from 5 data protection vendors and they all sound the same. But there's one core change and decision that we made early on that has actually now come to fruition as the biggest single benefit when it comes to the security posture of how we store the data. And that's the choice that we made it physically impossible to separate the backup software and the backup storage. And in fact, there's no ability to configure any storage within a Rubrik platform. So I'd almost liken it to the smartphone in the sense that, yes, it has storage. You don't configure that and present it. It's not accessible on its own right. It's only used by that software, which is why I take personal issue with Rubrik being included on, for example, the register in all the storage articles, that it's got storage in there, but we're not a storage company. And the reason being that we made that decision is because by removing the ability to separate the two, we remove the weakest link in the architecture on the left-hand side, which is the data is presented and accessible on the network via a standard storage protocol. And it was even just a year ago still considered by some as a negative as to why can I not just take Rubrik and replace the backup storage? Why can I not take Rubrik and just replace the backup software? And the truth is that it's only by replacing both that you can guarantee and maintain the security and integrity of the data end to end. As soon as you're using someone else's file system to store that data, someone else's storage, all of your security controls from a backup perspective go out the window. And so if the customer standardizes on Rubrik and replaces both, once the data is ingested, we store it on our own proprietary file system, no NFS, no SMB, it's all encrypted remote procedure calls. And all that means is that from any compromised server in the environment, there's no way that the attacker can browse, access, discover, or mount the underlying file system or backup data, but not even a Rubrik admin can access that file system and data. All they have is the interface. And this choice also allowed us to build the file system the right way, which is what is the most secure posture? Natively immutable. This isn't run periodically. This isn't turned on after the fact. You don't get a choice in this matter. Once a file has been written, it cannot be edited thereafter. And we now have 4,000 customers that we've gained in the last 7 years. Every single one of their backups inside Rubrik is natively immutable without them having to lift a finger. And the net result that we see consistently from all the major gangs, ransomware attacks against our customer base, is that a major attack is now a recoverable event from the first copy. And yes, standard backup best practices still apply where you want to send the data elsewhere, etc. I'll talk about that. But you're not doing that to protect the backups. The first copy is protected. We still need to consider, well, how do we do retention lock and ensure that can't be compromised, protect against time jumps, consider the default posture of the OS and the software. All of that detail I'll go into more on the next slide. But as for this fundamental difference of Rubrik versus anything else in the market that we play in,
I'm wondering how you enforce the immutable by right, because it's still software. And software can be modified, can have vulnerabilities, your standard day-to-day security, intelligence and challenges.
Agreed. All good questions, and I'll cover that on the next slide. If anyone's got anything else on the high level, I'll come back to it, but if not, let's answer your question. So you're right, still software that is vulnerable. So you've got to make sure that you're doing everything possible to protect both the operating system and the software itself. So I'm primarily going to focus in this talk about Rubrik inside a data center. If Rubrik is protecting anything outside in cloud, of, for example, O365, we went to great lengths to build that the right way, where it's just SaaS-based, it's secure, it's cloud to cloud, and you could do whole dedicated sessions on that. I'm going to focus on the primary risk today, which is predominantly data inside data centers, which is a funny switch, because especially when, like if you go back 5 years, everybody was very much against cloud and the security concerns. And there was so much of a focus on security that I believe that actually it's very rare that you hear anybody has had a ransomware attack in any of their cloud, because they've got so many accounts and disparate networking and hardened security, that the real risk for the majority out there is the data inside your data center. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And if you put Rubrik inside a data center, the best way to think about it is a bunker in a box, or a series of boxes together in a cluster. And Rubrik either provides the hardware or the customer provides their own and their certified builds. But the key thing that Rubrik is providing is not just the backup software. It's our own proprietary build of Linux that is hardened, everything unnecessary stripped out. And two key things: absolutely no Windows in this stack whatsoever. If you're running on Windows, you're most definitely going to be compromised as part of the attack. It's the one thing that we see in every single ransomware attack. AD is gone, it's compromised. So you can't have Windows, but you also got to watch out that you shouldn't be running vSphere and VMware either, because that is also an increasing attack vector. So it's got to be no hypervisor, no Windows, secure hardened build of Linux that is both patched and upgraded by the vendor, with no shell or OS level access. Because if I can access the OS, then quite rightly, it doesn't matter what controls you have on your software, I have access to your operating system and I'm going to do bad things. And finally, you're only as secure as your last upgrade, because everybody is still running libraries from various different entities, public, private, you name it. And so if it takes 6 months or multiple weeks to upgrade this platform, which is quite common, especially when you're looking at the 20, 30-year-old vendors, for me, it's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. By the time they get to the end, you have to do it again. So really importantly, that you can upgrade this with no downtime, couple of hours. It just does a rolling node upgrade and automatically upgrades all the agents out there in the environment, because you're only ever going to be as secure as your last upgrade. We then layer on our immutable file system. There are no third-party applications when it comes to any of the security scanning and capabilities that I'm going to move on to, which is important because as soon as you're bringing more vendors and their own code into the mix, all you're doing is increasing the number of attack vectors by interfaces, by their coding standards, and by just the sheer fact that now you've got more software running on top of this stack. We have end-to-end encryption in flight and at rest. And the customer can also plug in their own key management server to manage key rotation. And when you combine it with the fact that there's no internal NFS or SMB or a mountable file system, all this means is that you could spoof an IP address of this and you still can't access the underlying data. So the primary thing that you have to protect, the only thing accessible on the network, is the interface. And the highest security level posture possible if we're going to implement zero trust, and I know zero trust is an overused term, but I would argue if you're going to implement that in two places, one, it's got to be on your last line of defense, which is data protection and backup, and two, on your perimeter. Everything else is nice to have. So with true zero trust, built in to this bunker in a box, we don't even trust your MFA. We don't need it. It has its own globally enforced built-in MFA. No simple backdoors of just resetting via emails. Scan a QR code. Within 30 seconds, you've secured that account. You can use this for Active Directory users, but the primary use case is the local account to the platform, which you're going to use as break glass to recover everything else in the event of an attack, because your directory service is being compromised, it's down, and I need to get back up and running. But most customers combine this with their own MFA so that they get day-to-day ease of use for Active Directory. Anything SAML 2.0 compliant they can plug in. They have alerts for failed login attempts via syslog, via email. They can implement least privilege access and via role-based access control. But the core concept here, which stops the majority of attackers in their tracks, absolutely no login whatsoever as a backup admin role into this platform without MFA. And a lot of backup admins don't like this, but it's the only way to ensure that, hey, you can take my domain admin account, but you're not getting into my last line of defense.
With the bunker in a box concept, yeah. For me, kind of the important thing is normally the attacks have changed to very sophisticated attackers. They will try to find out where are the backups. If they are in the cloud, sometimes from your example, they will not attack directly, that they maybe can compromise the whole tenant and then more or less delete this on a different layer. So what I see kind of comprehending is the idea to have an bunker and thing that runs for its own. On the side, what is exposed. So I like to have this, let's say, secret backup solution as slim as possible when it comes to the attack surface. So what is visible for an attacker that is maybe in your network, try to scan what is visible from the Rubrik solution to somebody who is trying to move laterally in your network, yeah?
So the only two things that they can access is the HTML5 interface over 443 and then SSH. That's it. But both of those leverage the always on built-in MFA. So yes, you could establish an SSH connection, but if you don't have the token, you're not able to authenticate and log in. And even if you did, it's a limited shell where you have no destructive capabilities. They're basic abilities at best with standard networking, etc. And I'll come back to your point on the cloud piece, because right now I'm focused on the primary copy, but I will talk about how you maintain security if you send the data elsewhere. But those are the only two things that they can access. Nobody's logging in without MFA, irrespective of whether it's a local account or an AD, but it's still not enough, because you're still trusting that your backup admin, once authenticated, won't do bad things. And we are seeing more and more attacks against MFA providers, because now it is the most common method of protection. Just put MFA on everything and trust that will work, and you can't. It's not enough. So the next thing that we layer on is retention lock. And retention lock's pretty common in the industry, but how we do it is massively differentiated, because everybody else, it's a two-person rule, especially in the data protection space. And if an attacker can compromise one account, they can most definitely compromise the second, turn it off. Ours, once enabled, physically cannot be turned off by any one or two accounts inside the customer's organization. That is zero trust. Backups still expire as per the original retention, and they can still do the jobs day to day, but you can't make a negative or abnormal change. But if you have a legitimate business reason to reduce the retention, there is a process. The customer creates a support ticket. They verbally contact the Rubrik support verbally contact the people the customer specified in their organization to verify a change, generate a secure token auto expiring to make that change. And it's only with that external third-party verification that you can be sure there's no way any one or two users inside the org can start dropping the retention and deleting the backups, which is one of the most attack vectors. But even that's not enough, because the oldest trick in the book is, hey, I'm just going to have your retention lock and your backup platform then delete itself, because I'm just going to jump the clock and change it to 2050. So the final fail-safe that we have is, because you can't ever trust the time with a true zero trust approach, we don't trust it. We don't use it for managing backup expiration. And what we use is a monotonic clock in the Linux subsystem that is measuring the passage of time. So even if you jump the clock to 2050, we know enough seconds have not passed for it to be 2050, and it won't expire the backups any differently. And it's only when you put all of these security controls together that you can say, we have done everything physically possible to secure our first copy and make it impenetrable from an inside or ransomware attacker. And that's not to say one copy is enough. And I'll talk about the different places that you can send it and what we do there.
Where is the management platform running?
So there's two management platforms. There's one on the cluster itself, if you have no internet access, and then we have a global SaaS control plane with its own built-in MFA and the ability to plug your MFA too if you have a global estate.
Did I understand correctly that the person putting in the ticket to change the retention lock cannot be the one that support contacts to confirm it?
That's, well, they could be, but then they're going to call the other person to verify, and it's a verbal communication, and there's still a human here. Like, they're not going to say, oh yes, now 90% of your workloads I'm going to drop to 0 days. And so it's the human intelligence that really, for me, is the big fail-safe.
Okay.
Well, and I assume the platform is smart enough to not create an urgent situation where I've screwed up my backup retentions and I'm totally out of space and horrible bad things are happening. You've got some failbacks there to prevent disasters of that nature.
That's correct. But one other thing I want to give you is that this is very common in the security industry, not very common in the data protection space, but we are the only vendor that is willing to put our money where our mouth is. And I believe that we're the only ones that can do this because of all those aforementioned controls. And yes, we do have a $5 million ransomware recovery warranty, where if you can't get your data back, then we will pay for the services to help you get back up and running. But so far, I've only spoken about one copy of the data. These are the 4 most common deployment methods. I'll take you through quickly each one and who does what and why. Number 1, your data inside your data center, fast local recovery for a second copy offsite, also via a different storage medium, different security control. This is the most cost-effective deployment. Tier the data to cloud, layer on immutability and retention lock there. If you want to address traditional site-to-site disaster recovery, or maybe the second sites like VMware on AWS or Azure, you can go with number 2. But most customers actually want both, and they go with number 3. I don't want to buy 5 years of storage. I don't want to lose my ability to replicate and recover between data centers. I'm going to use both. And if we tier data to Azure or AWS, or we also have Rubric Cloud Vault, which is basically we provide Azure via Rubric account. So we're guaranteeing that, hey, the attacker can't compromise your Azure ID and your Azure account and anything locally connected. Just send it to our Azure account, and then you get a single bill and single throat to choke, etc. But we still have option number 4 of that we do have a solution. If you actually want a physical air gap and you have a legitimate need for it, we have it. It's called Rubric Vault. But anytime anybody comes to us and says, I need a physical air gap, our first question back is why? Because if you're only asking for that because the other vendor told you needed it, then let me take you through what we do in 1, 2, and 3. And that's why 99.99% of Rubric customers buy us for the security of number 4, but go with 1, 2, or 3. But we still have number 4 because quite often in the banking sector, it is mandated. They have an associated budget. I want an air gap. And one great use case is because I want a clean room, which itself I want to guarantee hasn't been attacked. And so we do have a solution there, but most don't go down that route because of the costs and the complexity associated. All I've got past is point number 1 in protecting the backups. And that's just one thing that we do. So the next thing we're saying is, okay, you've been attacked. And one thing you'll really commonly hear in this industry is every vendor says, I do anomaly detection. And the problem with anomaly detection is that it's very simplistic in that, hey, if a larger than normal amount of data changes, like let's say more than 5%, then flag an anomaly. I'm pretty sure the majority of us could probably script that in about 5 minutes flat, right? 5% more change rate, anomaly. And the problem there is that it just creates false positives because anomalies happen every day. And even worse, in an attack, all you're doing is the equivalent of somebody in the corner of the room shouting anomaly, anomaly, anomaly. You say, well, what changed? I don't know, just a lot. So it's useful on both sides, both pre and post attack. So the biggest differentiator of Rubric is that, yes, we start with an anomaly, but we don't immediately surface that. We automatically then take that anomaly and do a diff and a scan and compare against the previous backup. And we're looking at deletions, creations, modifications. And then if we see any new file created or modified, we then scan inside that file, and our pre-built model is then able to tell the difference between regular user activity and an actual encryption attack because we've trained it both with our customer base and actual ransomware samples continuously over the last 4 years. And the net result is that by looking at the entropy and randomization of the data in any changes that any backup platform can see, what we're then able to do is detect actual encrypted files. It's not signature based. It's just purely looking at the file heuristics, and the change automatically categorizes and removes the false positives of generic anomalies. And it cannot miss the one thing that the majority of all attacks still do to this day, which is they encrypt the data. You now get detection from your last line of defense, and it'll say it's these 500 servers and it's these 10,000 files that have been encrypted. And because this is built into the platform, this isn't relying on sending the data to a third-party piece of software to scan. You get this detection within 15 minutes. We can plug it into SIM/OSL tooling, Cortex XOR, QRadar, Splunk, ServiceNow are the most common. And then most importantly, we can recover that encrypted data. And this is a big gotcha I see quite commonly, is that every vendor in the world says, I can recover encrypted data. And they might even show you, oh, look, here's a file browser and .encrypted. But what they're relying on is the customer not picking up, well, how did you get to that? How am I going to build that list of what was actually encrypted and where, and then feed it in to even recover it? So the secret sauce of Rubrik is that we already have it. So you can recover the encrypted files, only the ones that you need. You're not overwriting good data, and you're reducing your start time to recovery. But this is primarily focused around files. For operating systems, I'm going to come back to that. It's a whole different ballgame, because yes, you can recover the file to yesterday, but you most definitely can't recover the OS. So I'll come back to that. And everybody agree that anomaly detection is useless?
Yes.
Thank you. There we go. We're on the same page. I spend every day of my life saying anomaly detection is useless. We need more people to say this. So for me, now the elephant in the room, the double extortion. They've stolen your data. I'm going to release it. Key question everyone asks, well, what have they stolen? And the honest answer is that if they've established persistence via backdoor, it's really hard to tell. You can tell, well, this is likely the minimum by inferring what they accessed. And Rubrik has a big shortcut here for our customers, because we can tell you what they encrypted. If they encrypted it, they most definitely had the ability to access it. So then the next question that we can answer for the customer, well, what was in that? So we have built-in sensitive data discovery. There's 60 different analyzers out the box for all the common data types. The customer can also put their own custom pattern and regex analyzers on top. And all it's then going to do is churn through all the data that you're backing up every day and tell the customer, these are the sensitive data hits that I found on these files on these servers. No dedicated team or huge learning curve for this, because it's not a new piece of software scanning and impacting or have to be installed and managed against production. It just runs against the backups. And then critically in the attack, because it's already done all the scanning and the legwork, we can then link it to, well, these are the 10,000 files that are encrypted, and this is the sensitive data that was in them. And if you think about this approach just from where it's running, data protection and backup platforms, incredibly busy 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. What do they do the rest of the day? It's like, for me, it's like a cat sat there cleaning itself, not doing very much. Why not leverage that compute to tell you what you're actually backing up? And that's what we do. But one important nuance, though, this isn't a replacement for an actual data classification tool if the customer is tagging and updating the metadata on files, because it can't do it. That it runs against it runs against the backups, and the backups are immutable. But we have customers who use this to validate that I actually have tagged all the data that I need to, and as a secondary source of information where you can ask big questions and not be scared of the impact, because it's just running using the spare compute that all backup platforms have. Interesting capability when you think about the possibilities of being able to query everything. And even like data classification tools, it's usually agent-based and only a subset of their environment, top 40%. This is against everything being backed up. So that development environment where somebody did a dump of critical data to a CSV, we've seen this. That is what is likely going to be stolen. But all I've told you so far is that we've detected the encryption attack, we can recover the encrypted files, and we can tell you what was in it. But then the next problem the customer faces, well, for anything with an operating system, I have the backups, but which one do I recover? I'm not going to just go to yesterday and reintroduce the attacker. And as you start to unpack this process, and this is something that we've seen over the last year and a half, is that you can be sat there and everybody thinks, well, I just have to know how long it takes to recover. But the real answer is that you might have to do multiple recoveries to identify the clean recovery point, because each time you do a recovery, it's then isolated. Load tools, forensics will then scan and say, this is good, no good, repeat, rinse, let's do it again. And the key problem here is you can't recover if you don't know when to recover to. So the big investment that we made in our last release, and we worked with the likes of Mandiant in the last year in building this out and making sure it was fit for purpose, is we built in our own threat hunting engine, whereby you tell Rubrik, you feed in your YAR rules, your indicators of compromise, be it files, paths, extensions, hashes, and then we take what you're looking for and scan the backups in their offline state. And critically, we do it across the time series. Because if you think about threat hunting today, very common. Everybody does threat hunting, but you're only able to scan right now because you're running against the server and the live data. We can do it across the time series because this is running against the one thing that backup has that nothing else does, which is I have likely at least the last 30 days. So I can tell you very quickly that actually you need to go back to 25 days ago because that is the time that they establish persistence. You could also throw in a YAR rule for cobalt beacons, etc., and see when they're traversing across the network and how. And because you're not doing the recovery to scan, first of all, you're minimizing the risk. But second of all, you're minimizing the time because you don't actually have to do the recover in order to do the scan. Find the point in time, do one recovery. And this is, of course, in the event of an attack. But interestingly, the default setting of a threat hunt is last night's backup. So there is nothing to stop a customer using this to proactively hunt for threats and do so with no production impact because, hey, this is the latest gang. I want to search my entire environment and scan every single file everywhere in my environment. Do it from your backup platform, no production impact. And today we're still on V1 of this. So it's very much focused in the event of an attack. You know which gang, even the FBI will give you a list of the hashes to look for their tooling. And this is going to help you zero in on that time quicker. But where we're taking this in the future is there's no reason that we can't then plug this in and automate proactively hunting so that you don't even have to plug it in. But the core concept is quickly identify clean recover point and only recover once.
What do you need? So normal process, you get your IR vendor in, you are detecting, you find now what the attacker did. What kind of things you need to do that? So how detailed must be the info for you to have an IOC that you then can run against your engine?
Yeah, so it depends on how accurate you want to be, but as you can see on the screen, like you can't guarantee everyone has a perfectly formatted YAR rule, and a YAR rule can look for all these individual things. And that's why we accept both, in that, hey, if you go and you have an up-to-date YAR rule for that gang, great, just copy paste it in and you're off to the races. But then if you're looking, for example, at an FBI alert, then usually they're just talking about files, paths, and hashes. So you can take those hashes, paste it in, and we'll just look for those hashes. So it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed. And that's why we have the multiple methods of entry. Because if you just said YAR rules only, then you'd have to, well, take those hashes and put that in a YAR rule, and that's a barrier to entry and just an unnecessary complication. So the final thing that we layer on is, hey, now I need to recover it. So built in, we also have built-in disaster recovery. I came from Zerto, as I said on the outset, and quite clearly now that the most likely use case for mass recovery from anything is going to be a ransomware attack. So you have to have that built in. So if you're doing site-to-site replication, either on-premises or to VMware on AWS or Azure, then you can layer on an application blueprint, which says, this is the boot order, this is the app, this is the resource configuration. We can also pre-hydrate virtual machines to reduce the recovery time, which I think is really important because there's a tendency in the industry to say, hey, do 10,000 live mounts and then rely on nobody realizing that that's 10,000 storage remotions, which frankly is going to be a multiple month-long project. So it's very important that you can pre-hydrate and rewind those VMs back in time. We can then also layer on traditional CDP to answer the CDP use case of sub 60-second RPOs. And then critically, 2 clicks to failover, fail back, and then prove that if you're asked, hey, if we need to recover our entire environment, how long would it take? Here you go. And then we have customers who use this to now replace the likes of Zerto and SRM and reduce complexity and secure DR. But the only caveat I'd say here is if you're, for example, using Zerto and going straight to Azure or AWS, and there's no VMware component. That isn't something that we do right now. Not this year, maybe more likely next year. But if it's VMware to VMware on-prem or cloud, most definitely we can address those use cases today. And importantly, do it from a secure and mutable copy, not be reliant on management components in a hypervisor, etc., which are of course easily compromisable. So wrap that together. This is now why we see the majority of customers switching to Rubrik. It's not just about a better, faster mousetrap and replacing backup. We're typically starting all of our conversations security first with the C-suite, the VP level, the security teams, and then being pushed down of, hey, we need to enhance our posture because it's not just about number one, it's everything else that we need in order to bounce back.